You've spent your whole damn life explaining yourself, haven't you? From the moment you dared to dream, from the instant your voice trembled with something different, something not yet proven, they circled you like vultures around a spark. You tried to tell them, tried to make them see it. You sat across tables, trembling, hopeful, with blood in your teeth and fire in your lungs, explaining the shape of a dream only you could see. You spilled your soul, wrapped it in words, made it sound softer, easier to swallow. And still, they blinked, doubted, laughed, questioned, not because they didn't hear you, but because they refused to understand you. You kept talking anyway. You explained your silence when you were hurting, because they demanded a smile. You explained your ambition as if hunger were a crime. You explained your darkness because the light made them feel safe. You bent your fire into shapes that made them feel comfortable. You dimmed yourself into acceptability. You made yourself small, palatable. You bled eloquence, and still they only saw mess. You walked around with chains made of words. Every link a conversation where you tried to be seen. Every shackle a moment you had to justify your pain. You tried to make them understand why you didn't want what they wanted, why you couldn't sit still in the life they handed you, why their boxes suffocated you. You said it gently, then you said it clearly, then you said it louder, then you screamed, and still, they said you were too emotional, too angry, too much. You became a translator for your own soul, interpreting your fire into their language, only to realize they had no intention of learning the dialect of your spirit. You became fluent in begging for validation. You explained your silence in crowds because your mind was louder than the room. You explained your distance as protection, not coldness. You explained your refusal to settle as self-preservation, not arrogance. You explained why you'd rather be alone than surrounded by people who cheered for your weakness, but feared your power. But what they really wanted was your surrender. What they craved wasn't your explanation, it was your resignation. They wanted you to give in, fit in, sit down, shut up, be like them. And when you wouldn't, when your soul screamed for more, they made you feel like you owed them a reason for existing as you are. You were born as a storm, and they expected you to apologize for the rain. You were a question that scared them, so they demanded answers, but not the truth. Numbered just something easy, something weak, something they could predict, digest, dismiss. And you gave it to them, didn't you? You lowered your voice. You made your victories sound accidental. You wore shame like perfume, so they wouldn't call you proud. You learned to take your pain and wrap it in pretty phrases just to keep the peace, just to keep them close, just to feel loved in a world that weaponized your difference. But every time you explained yourself to the wrong people, you carved away pieces of your truth. Every justification took a sliver of your soul and offered it up like proof you were worthy of staying. Every apology for your strength became a betrayal of your potential. And still, they never listened, not really. Because they weren't interested in understanding. They were interested in controlling, in shrinking you, in making sure you stayed in the box that made them feel big. Every time you opened your mouth, you hoped for freedom. But their ears were cages, and you kept handing over keys. The weight of that, it's not just exhausting, it's soul-crushing. Trying to convince the blind that your vision matters. Trying to justify why you're not what they expected, why you're not soft enough, quiet enough, predictable enough. Why you choose fire over comfort. Why your silence is sacred, not passive. So you started editing yourself. You paused before speaking. You softened every edge. You apologized before delivering your truth. You disguised your brilliance as effort. And still, they asked for more. Still, they told you to explain your urgency, your hunger, your wildness. They told you to explain your tears, but not cry. Explain your rage, but not raise your voice. Explain your power, but not use it. Explain your scars, but not make them uncomfortable. And here's the truth you've always known deep in your bones. No matter how many ways you say it, the wrong people will never hear you. Because your truth makes cowards twitch. Because your light exposes their shadows. Because your power reminds them of everything they abandoned inside themselves. But you kept trying. You kept believing that if you just found the right words, the right tone, the right moment, they'd get it. They'd finally see you. You kept performing your pain for people who saw it as entertainment, not as testimony. You kept defending your decisions to people who've never made a hard one in their life. You've poured explanations like blood into the mouths of people who were never thirsty for truth, only dominance. And that's why you're tired. That's why your heart is heavy. Not because you failed, but because you overgave. Because you spent so long trying to be understood by people who needed you to stay misunderstood in order to feel superior. But there comes a moment, there has to, when you realize the price of explaining yourself is your becoming. That every second spent translating your soul is a second not spent building your throne. That every conversation where you argue your worth is a conversation stolen from your evolution. That moment's coming. And when it does, you'll stop talking. You'll stop shrinking. You'll stop offering pieces of yourself like bargains in a war you didn't start. You'll stop explaining. And that's the day you'll start winning. They didn't just misunderstand you. They chose to. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't a lack of clarity on your part. It was intentional. They knew exactly what you meant when you spoke. They saw the truth in your eyes, but they twisted it. Because to understand, you meant they had to confront themselves. And that was never the plan. They called you dramatic when you were just passionate. They said you were overthinking when you were simply aware. They labeled you difficult because you asked questions they didn't have the courage to answer. Every time you showed a piece of your soul, they branded it as rebellion. They tried to mold you into something quiet, palatable, familiar, because who you really are, it terrified them. And it started early. You remember, don't you? The schoolyard, the way the other kids laughed when you dreamed out loud. When you said you wanted more, wanted different, wanted everything. They laughed not because your dream was funny, but because they'd already been taught to think small. And your fire made their silence feel like surrender. You remember speaking up in class, heart pounding, voice shaking, only to be mocked for trying too hard. You remember the look your parents gave you when you said you didn't want the life they carved out in fear. That expression, not anger, not disappointment, but confusion. Like you had spoken a foreign language, like wanting to be more, was a betrayal. And maybe it was. To them. Because people who settled see ambition as an insult. People who accepted their cage get offended by your refusal to stay in one. You remember the friends who smiled in your face and rolled their eyes behind your back, who clapped when you failed, not because they hated you, but because it made them feel safe. You remember the subtle jabs, the friendly teasing that wasn't friendly at all. The way they'd say, "You're too intense," or "You care too much," or "You're always so deep." As if depth was a crime, as if caring was weakness. They didn't want you to tone it down for you. They wanted you to tone it down for them. Because your energy, it was a mirror. It exposed the laziness in their spirit, the comfort in their mediocrity. You were the reminder of everything they gave up on. So they tried to reduce you to make their smallness feel justified. And what's worse is you let them. You laughed at yourself before they could. You made your hunger a joke. You made your potential sound like fantasy. You told them your goals in a whisper so they wouldn't judge you too loudly. You became smaller, not because it was who you were, but because it was the only way to be accepted in a world that feared your size. The pain of being misunderstood doesn't come from strangers. It comes from the people who should have seen you. The ones who raised you, grew up with you, claimed to love you. The ones who said, "I'll always be here," then disappeared the moment you became inconvenient. The ones who supported you when you were silent and struggling, but turned cold when your voice came back stronger than ever. They were fine with your suffering. It made you predictable. It made you easier to manage. But the moment you started to rise, the moment you dared to act like you belonged at the table, that's when the shift happened. That's when the masks slipped. That's when they turned misunderstanding into a weapon. They started twisting your words, claiming you'd changed, when really you just stopped hiding. They started questioning your character, doubting your motives, making you feel like the villain in your own story. You could feel it. The way conversations shifted, the way their tone changed, the way they stopped clapping, the way their silence screamed when you succeeded, the way they waited for you to fall again, so they could offer pity disguised as love. And all of it made you question yourself. You asked, "Am I crazy? Am I too much?" You looked in the mirror and tried to see what they saw, but all you could find was someone trying. Trying to be honest, trying to be brave, trying to make something out of nothing. You weren't the villain. You were just inconvenient. You didn't fit the roles they wrote for you. You outgrew the cages they were comfortable in. And you paid for that with loneliness. Because when the world misunderstands you, they isolate you. They don't say it out loud. They just stop showing up. Stop asking how you are. Stop including you. You become the ghost in the group chat. The one they talk about, but never talk to. You show up and feel like a foreigner in your own life. Like you're speaking truth into a vacuum. And there's no pain like that kind of solitude. Being surrounded by people and still feeling invisible. Smiling through conversations that feel like prison sentences. Listening to them talk about things that no longer move you. Laughing at jokes that don't land. Making yourself smaller again, just to survive the hour. But in that silence, in that exile, something happened. You started to hear yourself again. Started to see that maybe, just maybe, they never truly saw you. Maybe they only ever saw who they wanted you to be. And when you stopped playing that part, the love evaporated. The masks dropped. The misunderstandings weren't misunderstandings. They were rejections, polished, subtle, but sharp as glass. You weren't too much. You were just more than they could handle. You were too bold for the timid, too real for the fake, too deep for the shallow, too driven for the complacent, too honest for the manipulative, too self-aware for the delusional. And instead of rising with you, they tried to pull you down, because your wings made them feel like they were standing still. So they laughed when you spoke of greatness. They rolled their eyes when you got back up again. They clung to the version of you that begged, not the one that built. They were comfortable with your wounds, but scared of your weapons. And the cruelest part, you loved them. You wanted them to come with you. You wanted to bring them into the light. You shared your vision not to impress, but to invite. And still, they turned their backs. Still, they mocked the invitation. Still, they chose comfort over growth. And you had to watch them fade, not because you changed, but because they wouldn't. Now here you are, still standing, still misunderstood. But now, you understand yourself. You've stopped trying to decode their confusion, stopped shrinking to fit their definitions, stopped apologizing for being too full of life in a world addicted to death by comfort. You walk alone now, not out of bitterness but out of clarity, because you finally see that not being understood was never your failure. It was their limitation. You were never too much. You were just never meant to be explained, only experienced. You didn't just wake up one day and decide to bend. No, it happened slowly, quietly, like a rope fraying one thread at a time. You didn't even notice it at first. You were still smiling, still fighting, still explaining. But inside, something was unraveling. Every laugh that cut too deep, every silence that screamed rejection, every time you looked someone in the eyes, showed them your soul, and they blinked like it meant nothing. Each one stole a piece of your fire. You remember the exact moment it cracked. You were tired, not the kind of tired that sleep fixes, the kind that seeps into your bones, the kind of exhaustion that makes your chest feel hollow. You stood in a room full of people who claimed to know you, to love you, and still you felt like a stranger. They were laughing, talking, living their lives like everything was fine. And you were suffocating in plain sight. You said something honest, again, something raw. You peeled back your skin and handed them truth. And they dismissed it, brushed it off, laughed like it was a punchline. That's when the voice in your head whispered, "Stop. Stop trying to make them understand. They don't want to." But you didn't listen, not yet. You still believed there was something you could do to earn their understanding. You still believed love came with translation. So you tried again, softer this time. Maybe they just needed time. Maybe they didn't hear you right. Maybe if you phrased it better, smiled more, didn't make it so heavy. But no matter how you twisted the truth, they just kept missing it, missing you. And one night, you looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the person staring back, because you were folding in on yourself, shrinking, silencing your brilliance, laughing when you wanted to scream, agreeing when you were burning with disagreement, telling people what they wanted to hear, just to keep the peace, just to belong, just to stop feeling so damn alone. That's when you bent, not all at once, but enough. Enough to silence your instincts, enough to take your dreams and dress them in doubt, enough to nod when you should have walked away, enough to say I'm fine when everything in you was breaking. You bent because you wanted the pain to stop. You bent because the silence from those you loved hurt more than your own truth. You bent because being misunderstood felt like exile. And exile is unbearable when all you ever wanted was connection. You bent because no one told you that breaking apart for them wouldn't make them love you more. It would just make you disappear. And disappear you did. You became someone else, someone acceptable, someone agreeable, someone nice. Someone who stayed quiet when the fire inside was screaming. Someone who smiled through betrayal. Someone who dimmed their passion because it made others uncomfortable. But you didn't just lose your voice. You lost your self. And that was the real breaking point. It wasn't the moment they laughed. It wasn't the silence after your cry for help. It wasn't even the betrayal, or the distance, or the dismissal. It was when you stopped believing you were worth defending, when you stopped showing up for yourself, when you decided that being accepted was more important than being true. That was the darkest night, the night you looked at yourself and realized you couldn't even hear your own thoughts anymore, just echoes of everyone else's, their doubt, their fear, their shame, their smallness. You mistook their voices for your own. You mistook the absence of conflict for peace. You mistook approval for love. You mistook belonging for safety, but you weren't safe. You were suffocating, dying slowly in a cage you built out of other people's comfort zones. And still you stayed. Until one day, the voice came back. Not loud, not angry, quiet, firm final. It said, "Enough." And in that one word was everything you'd forgotten. Your power, your rage, your truth, yourself. It didn't roar. It didn't scream. It didn't argue. It declared, "Stop trying to make them understand. They're not your people. You don't owe them your silence. You don't have to fit their mold to deserve your voice." That was the shift, the resurrection, the moment you stopped bending. You realized you were never supposed to be accepted by the crowd. You were never made to be understood by those who only know how to hear echoes of themselves. You were never meant to play small for love. You were meant to stand tall. Alone, if necessary, misunderstood, if unavoidable, unapologetic, always. Because bending may earn you their applause, but standing earns you your soul. And your soul is not negotiable. You didn't vanish, you withdrew. Not in shame, not in surrender, not because they won, but because you knew. There's a silence more dangerous than 1,000 screams. A silence that hums like a blade being sharpened in the dark. A silence that doesn't beg for understanding anymore. It builds something unshakable. They thought you gave up. They thought your quiet was weakness. But they didn't see what was happening behind your stillness. You weren't broken, you were loading. You stepped back from the noise, the arguments, the explanations, the performance. You shut the door, not because you were hiding, but because you were done offering front row seats to people who only came to criticize the show. You stopped speaking, and the world started shaking, because they could feel it, even if they didn't know what it was. Your silence became presence. Heavy, unmovable, not needing applause, not needing permission. You became a storm without thunder, a reckoning without words, a force that no longer needed to announce itself. They had grown addicted to your vulnerability, to the way you used to bleed for their comfort. You were their mirror, their confessional, their punching bag. You made it easy for them to misunderstand you, because you kept trying to explain yourself to people who were never listening. But then you went quiet, and they panicked. Because your silence wasn't absence. It was intention. It said more than words ever could. It said, "I'm not here to prove anymore." It said, "I've reclaimed my energy." It said, "This isn't your access point anymore." It was in the way you stopped responding to the passive-aggressive texts, in the way you let their gossip die without oxygen, in the way you didn't correct their lies, because truth doesn't beg to be believed. You started speaking with your actions, and that terrified them because they had relied on your pain. They knew how to manipulate your explanations, your overthinking, your need to be understood. But without words, they had no weapon. Without your engagement, they had no script. You weren't retreating, you were training. In solitude, you found clarity. In silence, you found strategy. In stillness, you remembered who you were before the noise told you otherwise. You stopped asking, "Why don't they see me?" and started asking, why was I trying to be seen by people who refused to look? You let go of the need to be invited. You stopped waiting to be chosen. You stopped knocking on doors that were never meant to open for you. And in the quiet, you built, piece by piece, thought by thought, discipline by discipline. You constructed a version of yourself that didn't need the world's approval to exist. You became fluent in silence, and in that language, you wrote your return. Not as an explanation, as a manifestation. You stopped reacting and started evolving. You stopped answering and started becoming. And while they whispered about where you went, you were sculpting your comeback with blood, sweat, and solitude. Every moment they ignored you, you used it. Every conversation you weren't included in, you replaced with study. Every rejection, a rep in the gym, a page in your journal, a step in your mission. You pulled back, not to disappear, but to become too powerful to be dismissed. Because withdrawal is not weakness, it's war strategy. It's the lion crouching low before the leap. It's the phoenix burning quietly before the rise. They saw absence. You were making asterisk space asterisk. They saw silence. You were forging steel. They saw nothing, and that's what scared them the most. Because deep down, they knew. You weren't coming back as the same person. You were coming back unrecognizable. You withdrew because you were done performing. Because you realized real change doesn't need validation. It needs isolation. You were never meant to convince them. You were meant to become undeniable. You were always the one who smoothed the chaos, the one who clarified, justified, explained. You made it easy for them. Too easy. You carried conversations like burdens. You made room in your chest for their confusion, their discomfort, their assumptions. But when you stopped, oh, they noticed. The silence wasn't empty. It was a presence, heavy, charged, unapologetic. It pressed against the walls of every room you once filled with your over-explaining, your over-sharing, your over-giving. And suddenly, they felt it. They felt the shift. Because your voice had once been the cushion beneath their careless words. And now, that cushion was gone. Now they had to sit with the echo of their own ignorance. You didn't leave with a bang. No dramatic exit, no slammed doors, no final monologue. Just stillness, just space, just absence. And that was enough to shake the ground. They didn't realize how much they depended on you being the understanding one, the one who always came back, the one who explained her hurt in a way that made it easier for them to ignore. But now you were gone, and your silence said everything they refused to hear. They called it distance. They called it cold. They called it change. But what it really was growth. You didn't explain your loving. You didn't write them a thesis on why their presence was a poison you no longer drank. You didn't list the wounds. You didn't name the betrayals. You just walked, calmly, completely. And that scared them more than rage ever could. Because rage they could dismiss. But silence? Silence forced them to see themselves. They had to sit in the room you once filled with understanding and ask themselves, why did she stop talking? And they knew. They knew. They knew they pushed too far, dismissed too much, took too long to notice you were bleeding out in front of them. You had always been the translator of your own soul. But now you were done handing them the key. You were done lowering your frequency to meet their convenience. And that made them squirm. Because your silence was a mirror. And they saw themselves, raw, unfiltered, without the comfort of your explanations to soften the blow. You shifted the balance without saying a word, because when you stopped explaining, you stopped giving them control. And suddenly, They were the ones wondering, was it me? Yes, it was. And your silence confirmed what your words never could. You no longer needed their understanding to validate your truth. That was the day the power shifted. They talked. You listened. They assumed. You observed. They panicked. You breathed. Because you had become what they never expected. Untouchable. There were moments, many of them, where the old you would have stepped forward, clarified, defended, pacified, explained. But the new you stayed still, and they didn't know what to do with your stillness. You watched as they twisted your silence into whatever lie comforted them most. You watched them tell your story, wrong, loudly, publicly, confidently. And you said, nothing, because you knew the truth was never for them. It was for you. You saw their eyes searching for reaction,